Welcome to this week's episode of What a Hell of a Way to Die. Today you'll hear a conversation with myself and Matt Gallagher, an Army veteran and writer whose books include the memoir Kaboom and the novel Young Blood. I'd originally planned on releasing this as a bonus interview for our $5 Patreon subscribers, but I liked the discussion enough that I wanted to make it public for everyone. If you enjoy this episode and want to hear more interviews like it, please consider becoming a patron. Thanks.
Glory, glory, what a hell of a way to die. Glory, glory, what a hell of a way to die. Glory, glory, what a hell of a way to die. He ain't gonna jump no more.
Hi, this is Matt Gallagher. I'm an author living in Brooklyn now. I'm originally from Reno, Nevada. I spent 4 years in the Army from 2005 to 2009. I deployed in late 2007 for 15 months as part of the fabled surge. And those 15 months in Iraq were a formative time in my life and have been a big focus of mine for my writing career in different capacities, from the personal to the political.
And I'm not forgetting that you are the author of both Kaboom and Young Blood, correct?
That's correct. Author of Kaboom, which is a memoir, Young Blood, which is a novel, and also one of the co-editors of Fire and Forget, which was a collection of short stories about the terror wars that came out in 2013.
I knew I was forgetting something, so thank you for reminding me on that. Sure. I guess I wanted to start out by asking about the Kaboom, about your memoir and the blog that spawned it, because we have been talking, both you and I, online, as well as I've just been seeing this discussion around the internet about military dissent or even just like military opinions. And I'm wondering like how that got started with you blogging and how you kind of got caught up in, if I'm remembering correctly, kind of a furore about it.
Sure. Yeah. Take a trip back with me, I guess, to 2007. It was a more innocent time, both in the real world and on the internet. Petraeus had taken over, and so there was this kind of big shift in strategy to counterinsurgency. I was a young lieutenant at the time. We're getting a lot of briefings, a lot of PowerPoint slides. Didn't really make a lot of sense to me, so I just kind of hopped on the internet and started Googling around. And came across military blogs, some of which were written by soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan. A lot of them were kind of written by Cold War veterans, sharing their political opinions. Most of them conservative leaning. Those weren't very helpful, but the stuff by the soldiers on the ground, I found very helpful. It was informative. It was raw. It was truthful in a way that distorted Army language often cannot be. So I found it immensely helpful as we were preparing for deployment. It was also something that I think kind of inspired me to want to do myself. I'd grown up as a writer, writing and reading as a way to make sense of the world. I figured it would be kind of a cool thing to do, both to kind of chronicle what my scout platoon was up to, and also maybe serve as a time capsule for me. I think even then I was 24. I realized this was going to be a big informative part of my life, and how I related to it might change with time. I talked to family members who had served in the military and gone to war, and they talked very openly about how memory kind of could change how they related to that time. So I wanted something just to be there and remind myself what it actually was like for a 24-year-old history major who really didn't know what he was doing, trying the best he could with his 30 soldiers, not how an old man would look back on it and try to remember it and try to reshape it.
Yeah, and reading through Kaboom, one of the things that really struck me was just the sheer number of missions and anecdotes and things that you had. There was so much to it, and I realized when I thought back on my own deployment, like aside from the emails that my dad saved, like as a similar gesture, emails that I sent to him through my Nipper account, I've still got those. When I go through, there are so many things when I read my own emails, I don't remember them. Like I would completely have forgotten them. And I feel the same way when I read through your book, that in a way it's like the minutia, the day to day, the kind of like the anecdotes, the things that happen, like those will all, even if you have the greatest memory out there, you're going to lose some of it if you don't write it down. And so few people think to do that while they're there.
Yeah, kind of a modern day diary in that way, right? I mean, the day to dayness that you mentioned, I think is so vital. Everything's so dissonant, right? There's no each day, each mission. Hopefully it makes sense. Hopefully there's some kind of like through line to it, but I don't know. At least in our experience, that certainly wasn't the case. And as for kind of the dissent aspect that you mentioned earlier, I don't remember sitting down thinking, oh yeah, this is going to be my way to stick it to the green machine. My intent was just kind of be truthful and honest with any friends or family that were interested in reading about this stuff. On the other hand, truth and honesty oftentimes will have that frayed relationship with the powers that be, whether we're doing it intentionally or not. And I think that's what ended up happening with Kaboom. It was active for about 5 or 6 months, and for certain people in my chain of command, it was just starting to rub them the wrong way because I was just telling it how I saw it, right? I'd be the first to admit it was subjective, but talking about those kind of oddities or soldiers questioning the purpose of a mission, or how is escorting a wealthy sheik to the airport to get away from the Shia uprisings? How is that affecting the greater mission? How is that actually keeping the American people safe? Looking back on it. It was probably naive of me to not understand that was going to piss some people off. But, we were young and we were busy.
So when you were writing it, was it just like, hi, my name is Matt Gallagher, this is my blog, or was it like a pseudonym? I think back of those terrible blogger era names, like be like an Army at Dawn or something.
Yeah, it was definitely from that era. It was a blogspot.com.
Oh, hell yeah.
Yeah, you could put, it was kind of still the MySpace era, so the matching song that corresponded anytime you clicked on the blog was The Killers, all these things that I've done. I thought the irony of I've got soul but I'm not a soldier. I thought that was so poetic. I'm sorry, what was the question?
Yeah, I guess I'm asking because I'm wondering, you said your chain of command found out about it.
Oh, so this is still a point of contention. My moniker was LTG, but no, I wasn't advertising that I was Matt Gallagher. I was pretty good about operational security details. I wasn't using the sectarian town in Iraq we were in. I came up with clever nicknames for all my soldiers. I wasn't using any of the real Iraqi names. Certain details. It was clear we were not in a super urban area. You could probably tease some of that stuff out, but I would change the type of farming that the locals did, that kind of stuff. And my blogs, I would before I had published on them, I would share with my company commander. So I'd register with brigade and everything. I was definitely not trying to do the Colby Bazell raw, Joe's perspective, unvarnished thing. I was trying to be a dutiful lieutenant while also keeping in touch with people. But what ended up happening is my company commander got called home on emergency leave, so I was the senior lieutenant at the outpost, and in my the dumb, clever way that only a lieutenant can think, I was like, well, I guess I'm approving my blogs now. And that neatly corresponded with a really nasty conversation I had with my colonel, which I blogged about. And that ultimately was what pushed it too far for the powers that be, and what got the blog shut down. But really, look, I've had conversations with people who had been kind of following it during those months that it was up. It was just a matter of time. It had pissed off some people beforehand. They were just kind of looking for a moment to shut it down. That was just kind of I gave them the excuse they'd been looking for. So
in retrospect, when you think about what you were writing, it seems to me that although on one hand you might have been able to keep the blog going longer, had it been more pro forma Army, like I'm out here living the Army values kind of blog, but it probably wouldn't have been as authentic of a time capsule had you done that.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And I was never that type of HUA uh, officer to begin with. So, it would have been super disingenuous. It wouldn't have been something I was interested in. The people that fought for the blog, that supported it, that to include some people in uniform, saw the appeal in that. Part of this whole pro give Iraq back to the Iraqis movement that was happening. I still have deeply mixed feelings about coin, because in that moment, in that time frame, it was working, right? I mean, we were buying everybody off, but it was keeping my soldiers safe and alive, and that mattered to me, and it still matters to me. And how can you not explore that with some thought, without some ambiguity, right? And even in that moment, we knew it felt. We knew that's what was going on. It was the $1 trillion question. Can this sustain itself when we're not handing out hundreds of American dollar bills at every corner? We know that answer now. That was an open question then, right? Bringing a country back from the brink of civil war in that moment seemed like a noble pursuit, through any means possible. And writing about that was going to come with some dark questions and some dark ambiguity, and some folks in higher understood that, and many did not.
And so, looking back on it now, like the people that you clashed with, have you ever had conversations with them again, or did that relationship end when you got out of the military?
Oh yeah, it definitely ended. I bumped into at a writing conference at AWP a couple years ago. I bumped into a staff colonel who I vaguely remembered. I probably only had a couple conversations with, but he started teasing me a bit about the blog, and I gave me the whole other side of it. That we're the brigade commander, in fact, wasn't necessarily a fan, but he also didn't feel like roasting me the same way that my battalion commander wanted to really kind of put me through the ringer. So that was interesting hearing that punk young Lieutenant Gallagher had been a point of contention amongst the serious, important colonels back in the day.
Well, it also just seems kind of quaint now, because when you think about how easily you can access people's unvarnished opinions through things like through Twitter or Snapchat or something along those, any social media that just provides instantaneous communication. I'm reminded of that because a friend of mine joined the Army after he finished undergrad. He enlisted, and he's deployed right now. And periodically, I get like a Twitter DM or a Facebook message from him, because even at whatever COP he's based in right now, he'll dial up a Roshan phone or whatever on like an iPhone or whatever that's got Android apps, and he's able to send me messages. Like, he's able to be in touch. Whereas when I was in Afghanistan, my computer didn't have Wi-Fi for the whole year I was there, because we just didn't have it. I mean, so we felt hermetically sealed in a way, and that kind of means of getting information out was so much harder. And now it's weird, the idea of to think of a bunch of colonels getting furious about a blog. Like, I don't know, one hand is like, oh, that seems absurd. The other hand is like, well, no, now they just get mad about viral tweets or something along those lines. And it's in some way, some ways we were kind of part of maybe like that last gasp, like even the false guise of control that the military wants to be able to believe in, like top-down control. Yeah.
On the other hand, maybe it is similar, right? Like, only by trying to shut it down, it gave the blog way more oxygen. The same way that I saw something recently on some Marine chain of command was trying to get Terminal Lance to take down a post or take down a message that some junior Marines had sent him, and they were going to squeeze it out of him, right? And you're giving this so much more attention than it otherwise would have gotten. So in some ways, now as well as then. Having leaders that understand how the internet works and how communication works in the 21st century, there's not enough of them.
Well, it also makes me think too that back then there was this notion that any unapproved or unmoderated commentary that discussed any sort of reality in Iraq or Afghanistan was going to be negative and focused on the negative to the point where they needed to control it. And you could make the argument that, like, I mean, it would be very hard for somebody in, say, like March 2006 in Karbala to be like, oh yeah, things are fucking great today. We totally opened a school and it's awesome. I love this deployment. But on the other hand, the idea that you're so, I don't know, like the control freak aspect of that is so intense that it winds up making people distrust anything that isn't overtly negative because they assume it's been completely moderated. And now it seems to me that you can maybe get a slightly less varnished version of it.
The wars were still young enough back then, I guess, that the Pentagon felt it could somehow convince the American public that everything was rosy, that hearts and minds had been won, that the sanitized perspective would ultimately win out. Here we are a decade later. The wars continue to go on and go on and go on. Plus, just the ways of technology have changed, right? I mean, we had Facebook back then, but it wasn't used the same way.
No.
Everybody's just, you want the raw, unvarnished truth, and you know somebody over there. There's a million different ways you can reach out to them and get it.
Yeah. And I think about it too. You said this the other day on Twitter that you encountered someone who had been a high school student who was a fan of your book and has now become an Army officer and has deployed already. And there's this sensation of the just sort of eternity of it. I mean, I didn't respond, but I thought to myself, like, it's going to sound too glib for me to say this on Twitter, but my thought was like, yeah, my friends are either dead or majors now. Like, it's insane, but that's the way that it's gone, and it's still happening.
It's still happening, same places, which is incredibly depressing. Some part of the racket of being a war writer is, sometimes you go around to different colleges and stuff and talk to the ROTC units and ROTC cadets. And, in some ways, they still remind me of people from our day, the reasons they cite for doing ROTC and wanting to become officers, serve their country, pay for school, do something bigger than themselves, et cetera, et cetera. In a different way, though, and this actually happened at my alma mater, I was really struck by how differently they relate to the wars, right? Like, I asked the question of, like, well, do you think, Afghanistan is something you want to go help end? And they've had a very different, they're like, end? No, I mean, this is just, it's not even a question that is part of their process. It's part of their decision making. I mean, they want to deploy to do their part, but trying to bring something about to end has been bypassed somehow in their calculus, which I found shocking.
Yeah,
right. Because I was a freshman when 9/11 occurred. I remember watching the Iraq invasion from my dorm room, thinking with both relief and regret that Iraq would be over by the time I commissioned. Certainly, when I was abroad in 2008, as part of the surge, we maybe it was just get ourselves out of bed in the morning. I don't know, but we felt like we were working towards the end of something. Certainly these cadets can't speak for every young person who's joining the military, but we have given these kids, we failed them. We failed them if we've given them these kind of endless wars that they accept as simple fact that they will remain endless.
I feel like something that you just touched on is a really interesting notion, and it's something that I absolutely understand because I felt it the same way. That even if I was looking, say, my senior year of college in 06, 07, at like the absolute, just like when the surge became a thing they decided they wanted to do because Iraq had descended into a civil war. The feeling of, on one hand, this is horrendous and it's a bad thing, it should end, I don't want to do it. On the other hand, I feel as though I have to deploy because otherwise I won't be doing my part. And it seems to me like that is such a common thread through so many people's stories that it's almost as though it's like a thing you have to be wary of because you're going to have people that are willing to volunteer even if the endeavor is not going to accomplish anything. And I think about that too because like I said, one of my friends who's deployed right now, who's a junior soldier, he'll text me things and there's a part of me that almost feels a sense of like a frisson of excitement when I'm talking about like, oh yeah, do this, do that. Here's a thing. Here's something that I experienced. Almost like I'm back there. And then part of me is like, oh, that would be so exciting. That would be way more alive than what I'm doing right now. And the other part of me is like, yeah, but that's fucking stupid. I deployed 10 years ago. And the idea that a 23-year-old is out there doing the same thing that I was doing That's
Right.
just depressing. But it's like you have to kind of you have to almost inhabit this dual consciousness on one hand of knowing that it's objectively a failed venture, and on the other hand, understanding that like that didn't stop you from doing it yourself in your day. Why is it going to stop someone now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's gets really at the heart of it, and it's how the system, how the government, how the older generations have failed in my estimation. I think it is a normal thing for young people, particularly young people who aspire to be soldiers, to want to do that, right? To prove themselves. I think it is up to the older people, particularly older people in power, to rein that in, right? To ensure that we are only tapping into that youthful bravado, that youthful courage, that youthful exuberance when absolutely necessary, right? And in a healthy republic, that's how it plays out. We are not a healthy republic these days, and instead, we just kind of shrug our shoulders and kind of have a sanitized thank the troops for protecting us without asking these hard questions of how they're protecting us, right? Are we utilizing all of that correctly? I think it's a good thing that a young person in uniform wants that. It's not for them to determine for that to happen or not, right? And there's all kinds of reasons why that the societal bulwarks have been eroded to the point that those questions no longer get asked by the people that should be asking them. The most prominent example that everybody on NAPSEC Twitter rants about every day, and deservedly so, is the fact that we're still using the AUMF, the Authorized Use of Military Force, from 2001. I mean, that's just fucking absurd.
Oh yeah, and I mean the idea that that has now been extended to things like conflict in Yemen or in Syria, and it just seems like it's sort of like a negation of the War Powers Act, in the sense that like we passed this law to stop this from happening again after Vietnam, and then we're just doing it again, actually on a longer term. And then I guess also, to me, I feel like that kind of dovetails into my next question, because there's an extent to which that notion gets weaponized by the right, and you see that in some of the invocation of the military by the right, whether it's by President Trump or by other people like him, as this really weird abstraction that's used only as a cudgel or as like a beacon of respectability, but has no real bearing on what we're asking these young people to do.
Absolutely. You see it in different ways, right? The top level, strategic level is, well, trust the generals, listen to the generals. That's a cop out, right?
Yeah.
We have civilian leadership for a reason. Lincoln didn't listen to his generals, and he fired a bunch of them until he found his man, right? Truman certainly didn't listen to his generals, right? And he had to stand up for his office during Korea to remind MacArthur of that, right? And then on kind of the lower tactical societal level, right? You see oftentimes the right pointing to soldiers, in a very vague cipher-like way of, they're protecting us, they're serving us. It allows me to absolve then my duties as citizen to ask these hard questions that, the neighbor kid down the street who joined the army, is he going to deploy next year to Syria for a reason that I agree with, right? Am I going to do my citizen's duty of asking my elected official, hey, what about that AUMF? Hey, how much money did you get from defense lobbying firms last year? For me, I think a lot of this kind of all goes back to the end of the draft, right? And it allowed a lot of middle class America to kind of wipe its hands of these dirty, messy questions that entail American foreign policy, these issues are going to continue to get compounded until there's some kind of reckoning, and that reckoning isn't going to happen from the top down. It's going to have to come from the bottom up, in my estimation.
Well, I mean, I think that too. I mean, I do think that there's going to come a point when there's going to be an undeniable outburst from the people who are really bearing the brunt of this. But I don't know how that's going to come and what that's going to look like. And I know that when you see it, it's probably not going to, people seem to think that, and not to be too cynical, but people do think that these moral questions are easy in their time, and they're not. And there are going to be plenty of people that you and I might respect who are going to see someone or a group of people putting their foot down about this and highly disapprove of it. And so it's like one of those things where we won't know what it looks like. We just know that it's obviously unsustainable. And as it drags on, I don't know, I feel the same way about the way the Army was in the mid 2000s, that I feel like the Army as an organization fundamentally broke down in so many ways. And I experienced this at my first unit, where there were things that were unthinkable in terms of, deploying at 70% strength and dealing with, just unbelievably unfit soldiers, not just physically unfit, but emotionally unfit as well. And you think to yourself, okay, this shouldn't be happening. We have systems in place that are supposed to stop it, but they weren't. And so to me, like when a breakdown happens, there's not like a big red flashing sign that says it's breaking down. It's not like a light in a car. It's just, it happens. And I wonder what that's going to look like. And part of that question is faith in political leaders. And that brings me to the point that I wanted to touch on next, which was your recent piece in the New York Times. When Trump visited Iraq, you wrote the piece with the headline, "The President's Field Trip to the Forever War." I'm wondering, how has your reaction to that been? I mean, both like, if you want to talk about the reaction you felt seeing that, and then also the reaction you've gotten from publishing it, from taking a vantage point on Trump.
Sure. I'll take those one at a time. I mean, the reaction I felt, which kind of inspired the piece, was just mostly revulsion. I mean, Trump is just such a clown, and seeing this man who's done everything in his power and his life to avoid serving anyone but himself, glad hand people in uniform and turn a very routine airplane landing into some grand crossing of the Alps like Hannibal. It's just pathetic. Anybody who's ever aspired to do something authentic with their life just had to look at that and scoff. On the other hand, it was amazing to me, and I touched on this in the piece, just how forceful the pushback to that trip was, coming from all corners. And I thought it kind of corresponded with his recent, although he since walked it back, declaration to pull out of Syria, right? And you just kind of realize, occasionally the idiot squirrel finds an acorn, and maybe that was the case with Trump, right? And he just lit a fire in the defense industrial complex for daring suggest that their reach be scaled back some. The way he suggested going about it is certainly idiotic. I don't think it's coming from any kind of ideological or brave philosophical standpoint. He's just kind of a raving loon trying to change the headlines. But it's something that I think any person that cares about American foreign policy has to look at, and no matter how much they revile Trump, has to wonder, like he said last night in the State of the Union, great nations don't fight endless wars. He's right. And, reconciling that with everything else that Trump is wrong about is okay, and is what a thinking person has to do to get through this world. So I put that all in the piece. As for the responses, you know this well yourself, Nate. Anytime you publish in a big venue, you get some great notes of support from people you haven't heard from in a while. You also just get some really bad faith misreadings, and then you get some crazy responses.
Yeah.
What I didn't get a couple years ago, I did something for CBS, and a guy told me that he wanted ISIS to execute me. So I didn't get anything that out there this time. But you do get some crazy folks wishing horrible things upon you. They seize on different things in your biography. for me, I found it so strange that some folks were so dead set. People that probably I vote similarly to, people were so set in their anti-Trump perspectives that despite the fact that I open and close the essay essentially calling him a moral and physical coward, which I believe, they thought it was some kind of the piece was attempting to normalize him in some way, because I said, hey, maybe he did stumble upon something correct here, and we need to ask ourselves why he's getting this blowback from people ranging from Max Boot to Bill Kristol to these think tanks, et cetera. So it's I'm more used to it now than I was a few years ago. I'm like most writers, I'm a sensitive soul, but you do this enough, you just kind of get used to it. And unless it's something truly crazy, like somebody wishing ISIS come after you, it's all good.
Well, no, I mean, I get it, man. I mean, I'll be the first to admit that there have been times when my brain has been melted from the experience, and I go back to it. I'll still publish pieces, but periodically I'll take a break because it's just so insane. I guess I asked that question because I witnessed some discussion about Trump's visit and then about the landing at Ramstein Air Base, where Trump supporters in uniform came out, and there was a debate about wearing MAGA hats or waving a Trump flag in uniform, if that was allowed or not. And it struck me that related to this was that there is a weird and understandable reaction because Trump is such a vulgar figure, but he's still the president. So even though he says and does things that would literally get you punished under UCMJ, he's still the commander in chief. And there's this weird disconnect that's really hard for, I think, veterans, military, defense people to reconcile, is that nothing can stop that. And it's horrifying, but it's just, you see this person, the person who's calling the shots, the person who's signing the bills, the person who's doing all these things, whether, like you said, he happens accidentally on an idea that is actually an important thing to pursue, which is ending the war. It doesn't matter. He's still this hideous figure. And I think that I totally understand why it would be obnoxious to have people get mad and say that you're normalizing him. Because I read this piece and I was like, this seems very, very critical of Trump. But it's just, I feel like there's still a weird kind of denial about it. That he's the president. Like he actually is. He won. This is real. We might live in hell, but we are alive.
Yeah. It reminds me a bit of that old Fitzgerald quote, right? Like a sign of first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two clashing ideas at once, and still be able to function. I'm paraphrasing. And, I think that's important as thinking people that were able to do that, and as citizens at least. As for the soldiers, I try to remind people that we're. The hats and the flags, that was way too much. I don't care what that Air Force JAG said. That's wrong. And retired General Hertling, as he said on Twitter, is right that's too far. I would understand if I was a platoon leader or company commander over there. I would totally understand soldiers wanting to go to see the commander in chief speak. There's a way that you do that stoically as a professional, and don't cross that political line. Also, for all those people, airmen and soldiers wearing the red hats and waving the flags, there's not a doubt in my mind there were just as many folks sitting in their hooches who refused to go, particularly soldiers and airmen of color. Right, given the things that Trump has said about them and their families in the previous few years. I noticed the military can be a Caucasian place, but it's not that Caucasian.
Yeah, for sure.
And that was something that stuck out to me in the photographs and videos I saw from Trump's visit to Iraq. So that was something, just because it's not there, it's not screaming at you, it's not behind. It's not behind the podium. I found it important to remind myself and to try to remind others that there were people in uniform who refused to go out of principle.
So I'm wondering, as a veteran writer, though, I mean, have you butted up against that? Because I felt that prior to Trump getting elected, I had whether it was naive or not, the ability to deny that there was a forced political or politicization. A forced politicization of being a veteran, that you could be in a space with veterans and you could talk about the veteran experience and it wasn't objectively political. But it feels like that's harder now. Like that's just almost impossible because what you did in the military, the thing that made you a veteran was political. And also at this point, the politics, there's a fault line amongst veterans when you think about the ones who support Trump versus the ones who don't.
Very much agree. I think there's probably two aspects of it. That's always kind of there. I mean, war is inherently political, and I think it's important while you're in uniform to try to not hide from that, but try to keep that to the side so you can focus on doing your job. At least as long as you're working at the kind of the tactical or operational level, it gets a little different. I think once you reach strategic, but war is inherently political, and the further I've gotten from my own time in uniform, the more I've understood that, and the more I've just kind of come to accept that, and as a citizen try to remind myself of that as I watch young soldiers and airmen and Marines go about their business. But as with anything, I mean, Trump is just such a hurricane. I think that that fault line you were mentioning, in the veteran rider community, it's been totally exaggerated by these times and by this force, because he does this on purpose, right? He's a divider in all things. So we're not, the veteran riding world is one small small ecosystem in hundreds and thousands of ecosystems in American society. How could it not be impacted the same way all of them have been? A friend of mine, Brian Van Riet, just published an essay. It was also a speech he gave in Paris, talking about kind of red state literature and blue state literature, and it touches on this very thing that there are certain signifiers of a contemporary war story that reader will cue readers to, whether it's for blue state readers or red state readers. He'd be the first to say that it is more complicated than that, but any good conversations, should start with kind of stark polls like that. And there's a lot of truth to that, right? If you're trying to inject nuance, if you're using pretty similes, if you're even willing to admit to anything resembling like regret, that's probably going to be a blue state book in military literature. If it's packed full with hypermachismo or corporate, from the
platoon to the boardroom kind of shit.
It's just endless Navy SEALs hyping their talking points for Wall Street, or if it's all kind of glory bound and hero focused, pretending to be sanitized of politics and the swamp in DC and libtards. Yeah, that's a red state book. But like with all things, it is more complicated than that. A great example of a red state book is American Sniper. But I do actually kind of find that book is kind of bad in some ways, but it's also super interesting, right? Because Chris Kyle was kind of an interesting guy. I mean, he was a legitimate war hero who was also a serial liar.
Yeah.
Like what would drive a person who's accomplished, many incredible things, right? Like, I'd be the first to say I was glad Chris Kyle was wearing the same uniform as I was when I was in Iraq, even though Chris Kyle and I would probably hate each other if we were ever to try to sit down and have a political conversation. What drives a person like that to still feel the need to lie about what happened in New Orleans during Katrina? That's really human, and that's really interesting to me. Chris Kyle could probably make a great protagonist in a blue state literary exploration of contemporary military and contemporary war. I hope somebody does it, and muddle it up a little bit, because I think personally, I think literature is at its best when it is messy and gray, and this polarization that has occurred for the forces we've talked about isn't good for the work, and it's not good for us as a people either.
It's funny because we used to run Facebook ads, and one of our taglines for the show was that we were the American Sniper's least favorite podcast. We realized
Excellent.
that there were some jokes we are trying to make, and we realized that they were either going to come across as we were profiting off his name, or that we were somehow intimating that we killed him. And so we're like, okay, both of those are bad. We've got to just back it off for a while. But it's interesting to me though, because when you get down to it, there's a niche audience for war fiction, contemporary veteran fiction, but there are people who read it who are outside the veteran community who are interested in literary fiction, and then there obviously are a lot of veterans, some of whom may not necessarily be really tied into literary fiction, but they will read things even if they're like less, they're more, I don't know, abstracted or more evocative things if they're written by veterans. But then the average American who buys books or sees books on sale is probably seeing, from the platoon to the boardroom kind of stuff, or American Sniper, the other Navy SEALs books, whatever they might be. There's so many of them. But it feels to me like what that speaks to is this fundamental separation. Like whether you're a person who wants to read veteran fiction because you think it's going to be insightful, or whether you're a person who, just sees a book and thinks it's a book about leadership, unless you've got a personal connection to the military, the chances are good, just like on average in America, that it is an abstraction to you, whether it's the one you think of because it's going to teach you how to like get 6-pack abs, or it's going to teach you about some like emotional truth about the war, it's still abstracted.
Absolutely. And absolutely, as a person, it's deeply troubling. As a writer, I at least what I've landed on is I take it as a challenge, right? Like, I want to reach people that I probably wouldn't agree with, on the politics, but still find a story I find engaging or interesting. That's been a challenge, I think, for a lot of people in the veteran writing community. One example, my next novel, it has superpowers. And I'd be the first to admit that part of the reason I put those in there was because I wanted to reach people who otherwise wouldn't give contemporary war literature a shot, right? When my novel came out a couple years ago, I can't tell you how many otherwise really smart, really engaged, thinking people who vote left, who vote right. Oh, war writing isn't usually for me, but I gave yours a shot because of X, Y, or Z. What is that? I mean, that's just not something that the Vietnam writers ever had to encounter, right? The importance, the connection, first, I think for some very obvious reasons, was built in to their work and to their work's relationship to the reader. So I think it's on us as contemporary war writers, be whether our backgrounds are veteran or civilian, to devise ways of reaching people, because this shit really matters, right? American foreign policy, whether we like it or not, reflects on us all. It's part of the country we are. It's part of the country we project to be. I think it's agree with it. Okay, fine. Disagree with it. All the more reason why. As a writer and reader, you should be wrestling with this stuff. So, whether it's blurring genre, which has been my most recent approach, whether it's just writing a kick-ass Netflix show or something else, I think it's imperative on the creative minds who care about this stuff to figure out a way to reach more people.
Do you ever ask yourself questions about like authenticity when you're writing about veteran anything? Because I felt like I'm a subject matter expert for the thing that I experienced, and everything else is just me kind of like extrapolating. And I wonder sometimes when I want to like go beyond just retelling the same 13 months of my life, am I inauthentically telling that?
Very much. It's something that I think any serious writer grapples with. In whatever their subject is, and certainly combat makes that relationship even more heightened. There was a point a couple, I would say 4 or 5 years ago, when I was like, I'm sick of mining the same tour. I care about these issues, but I've said more than my fair share about what this was and what it meant or what it could be. So whether it's talking to younger veterans who are more recently coming back, or reading different works, reading different perspectives, I guess one example, a recent book that I read was Will Macken's story collection, Bring Out the Dog. I have a very poor perception of Navy SEALs. My brief interactions with them, both overseas and back here in the States, have been overwhelmingly negative. They, in my experience, fit every negative stereotype known to peacocks, brash, poor planners. Name it, I've seen it. That has been my experience with Navy SEALs. Will Macken worked with SEALs as a JTAC, I believe, and wrote a beautiful, endearing story collection about them. I've never met Macken. I'd love to sit down with him over beers and find out more about him and his background. But it put SEALs in a different light. The closest thing, if you'll indulge me, this quick aside, it reminded me. I'm originally from Reno, Nevada. I spent 18 years wanting to get out of Reno, Nevada, thinking it was a place of low culture and insert any kind of stereotype of an angry teenager disliking their hometown. I had it. Right. It wasn't until I read Claire Vaye Watkins Battleborn, which is a story collection set in Nevada. And she's from rural Nevada and went to college in Reno. And she writes about Reno beautifully, because for her, Reno was a cultural oasis. It has an art museum. It has a university. I didn't interact with that a lot as a punk high schooler, but it's all there. And it really made me look at my own hometown in a new light and starts the journey to being more generous, or at least more understanding of something that I had oversimplified because of, I was 15 and that's what 15-year-olds do. In a very strange, non-tangential way, Macken did that with me for SEALs. And I think both of those are examples of what literature can do. Right, it can bridge these divides between people, between cultures, between preconceived notions and set stereotypes. And no, not enough people in 21st century America are willing to read these books. There are some people that will never be willing to do those beautiful, important things I just mentioned. But they're out there, right? And it's still worth pursuing. And as artists, as veterans, as citizens, all of that. I think it's just vital that we just keep grinding away, keep trying to do it, because the alternative is just far too stark.
I don't know if you've read Nico Walker's Cherry.
I think I'm the last person on the planet that hasn't. No,
it's good, but it's. I was going to say that I felt I'm from Indiana, and like this book's set in Ohio, not too far from where I'm from. And on one hand, like after reading that, I don't know. There's so much. It's authentic, but there's just so much ugliness to it. That's true to the experience. That in a way, after reading that, I was like, I'm glad I read this. I'm glad someone did it. I don't know if I ever want to like fixate on this idea that authenticity has to mean like rubbing people's faces and things anymore, because after reading this book I felt so jarred that I was like, maybe there's somewhere beyond it, because obviously like I've tried to write in a way that at least has been in some way representation of like, I don't know, the details, and it was weird having that experience reading that, and there's, I don't know, as a writer you read something that good, you think to yourself like, I should be jealous. But instead, I'm just sort of like, all it's done is just kind of like change my perspective in a way. And so, I mean, I'm not a particularly big fan of Navy SEALs either. For me, at least in my experience, when I was deployed, they were just like the Keystone Cops, except for war crimes. But I will give Will Macken's book a shot. I think you should read Cherry. I mean, you may not like it, and I absolutely understand why someone might read that book and not like it, because there are some things about it that are just like, maybe, I mean, it's just. We could spend an entire episode talking about it. It's just one of those things where I understand where somebody didn't like it. I wouldn't say like that someone has like a lesser judgment if they don't like a book that I like. But I do think that confronting people with those details and confronting people with stories that can make them, I don't know, re-examine their prejudices is obviously a good thing. There's times when I can feel as though I have the energy to do the work, and other days I don't, and it's a challenge. So sure. This is good. I mean, I'm glad. It's good hearing you say that, because I mean, like, knowing that you wrestle with that too means that I'm sure that basically every one of us is, every person who's trying to make sense of where the fuck's going on right now is wrestling with it.
I think if you're not asking yourself those questions when you sit down to write, something's gone wrong. Like if you're too certain with your purpose and your goal with something, it might be time to take a step back. And I probably made that exact same blunder sometimes in my own career. And, as for Cherry, just real quick, I'd be the first to admit, I think my hesitancy with it has been nothing to do with the text I've seen. It's been kind of the marketing and the reaction to it, right? Like that I find really distasteful. Kind of romanticizing the bank robber kind of thing.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. There's that.
Romanticizing the drug addict aspect of it, and it's just like, now wait a fucking minute. I mean, this guy, he's serving his time. He's paying his due back to society. But let's not forget that the only reason any of this came to be is because he pointed a gun at a pregnant bank teller. Right? That's not romantic. That's not sexy. That's fucking awful.
And also, do you remember, I gotta say this too, like, as aside from the publishing industry, does it not kind of rub you the wrong way sometimes when you're like, wow, that's really awesome that the way that an enlisted soldier was able to get his fucking book published was that like some dudes in Brooklyn were like, oh, wouldn't that be awesome that there was a Iraq vet but was also like a bank robber? Like, oh, he's real? Like, the extent to which it seems as though that was done because it's kind of like a Bam Margera skit instead of like a dude's life that's clearly gone off the rails.
100%, right? And in a strange way, and again, I want to preface this by, it seems like Walker can really fucking write, and that matters a lot, and that's very important. But there's absolutely, part of the reaction has been this weird thing of like fulfilling some kind of weird fantasy that a certain type of American society has or projects upon the American veteran and what the American veteran is, right? I don't know. I like literature that challenges things, not reinforces it. And some of the way, an Iraq vet comes home and gets addicted to drugs and robs a bank, you can see some of the reaction. At least it's fulfilling these preconceived notions. And does that matter as much as the writing? No. And that's what ultimately I will ultimately give Cherry a read, because very smart people that I trust say he can write. But there is something really distasteful about the reception, and it has nothing to do with the work.
I mean, I absolutely agree with you, and I think that what you'll probably find is that the writing is tremendous, but there's this starkness to it, but it's also so incredibly bleak that I understand why someone would come away from it and just be like, I feel as though I've just watched a snuff film. So
Gotcha.
Yeah, okay. I mean, it's just that. I mean. Some people want that, and some other people like literature. Maybe they don't have time in their lives to have another thing to be depressed about. So
2019 is probably not the time for that.
Yeah. No, right, exactly. We're going only positivity in 2019 because, if we can manage it. Matt, thank you so much for making time for this. It's been great to talk to you. I wanted to give you a chance to plug anything you've got going on right now, anything you want me to mention in the show notes so that we can make sure our fans listen to it.
Sure. I guess my most recent book was a novel, Youngblood, came out in 2016. I'm very proud of it. It's set a few years after I was in Iraq myself, and it's got romance. It's got a little bit of violence, but not too much. And more than anything, I think it was my creative attempt to reconcile whatever the Iraq War from 2003 to 2012 was. In its entirety. So if any listeners are interested in my work, in addition to the Google, that's where I'd recommend starting.
Cool, man. Well, Matt, thank you so much again, and look forward to seeing more work from you in the future.
My pleasure, Nate. Good talking with you, man.